In 1976, a military junta seized power in Argentina. What followed was not a civil war. It was not combat. It was a program. The government identified people it considered threats. Students, journalists, union workers, lawyers. It built a system to make them disappear. Agents in unmarked cars arrived without warning, usually at night. People were taken from their homes, their workplaces, the street. No charges were filed. No arrests were recorded. Detainees were held in secret facilities, over 500 of them operating across the country. They were interrogated, tortured, and in most cases, killed. The bodies were disposed of. Some were buried in mass graves. Others were dropped from aircraft into the Rio de la Plata. Families received no notification. Official records showed nothing. Between 1976 and 1983, an estimated 30,000 people were taken this way. Most were never seen again. This actually happened. This actually happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten, to understand what they reveal about power, human nature, and civilization. Because history demands to be remembered. Adriana Calvo was 8 months pregnant when they took her. It was February 1977. She was a physics teacher in La Plata. They put a hood over her head before she even reached the car. The standard procedure, a detail that tells you something about how thoroughly this system had been thought through. She was driven to a clandestine detention center. She gave birth there, on the floor, blindfolded, surrounded by her captors. The child survived. Adriana survived. Most people who entered those buildings did not. She would spend the rest of her life testifying about what happened inside. What happened inside Argentina between 1976 and 1983 was not chaos. It was not a war spinning out of control. It was a deliberate, methodical campaign conducted by a government against its own population, designed, bureaucratized, and executed with the kind of administrative precision that should chill anyone who has ever trusted institutions to protect them. The generals called it the process of national reorganization. They used a word, proceso, that made it sound like paperwork, like something happening in an office, which, in a way, it was. To understand how Argentina arrived at this, you have to go back a decade earlier, into the particular madness of the late 1960s and early 1970s, a period when the country was being pulled apart by forces that fed on each other. Juan Perón had been in exile since 1955, thrown out by a military coup, and in the years since his removal, Argentina had lurched between civilian governments and military interventions, never quite stabilizing. His movement, Peronism, remained the dominant political force in the country, which is why the military kept banning it. You cannot ban the political allegiance of roughly half a country and expect nothing to happen. What happened was the guerrilla movements. The Montoneros on the left, the ERP, the People's Revolutionary Army, on the far left. They robbed banks. They kidnapped executives. They detonated bombs. They assassinated a former president, Pedro Aramburu, in 1970, stuffing his body in a farmhouse basement like a rebuke written in flesh. The violence was real and it was serious. People died. That matters. It cannot be footnoted away. But here is what also matters. When the military junta seized power in March 1976, overthrowing the elected president Isabel Perón, the guerrilla movements were already in serious decline. The Montoneros had been fractured. The ERP was losing. The armed threat that the generals would use to justify everything they were about to do was, at the moment of justification, largely broken. This was not incompetence. This was a choice. The junta, led initially by General Jorge Rafael Videla, Admiral Emilio Massera, and Brigadier Orlando Agosti, was not simply trying to defeat an insurgency. They were trying to reconstruct Argentine society from the ground up, to remove, permanently, anyone who might challenge their vision of order. Leftists, trade unionists, journalists, lawyers, psychologists, teachers, priests who had sided with the poor, students who had read the wrong books. Adriana Calvo was a physics teacher. She taught physics. The question her captors kept asking her was about her membership in a teachers' union. Think about that for a moment. The machinery they built to do this was extraordinary in its reach. The country was divided into 5 military zones, each zone subdivided, Each subdivision with its own chain of command, its own detention facilities, its own disposal procedures. There were over 500 clandestine detention centers operating across Argentina during this period, converted warehouses, police stations, military barracks, a naval mechanics school in the middle of Buenos Aires called the ESMA that processed an estimated 5,000 prisoners through its rooms. The ESMA is important. It is important because it sat in a residential neighborhood, surrounded by normal life. People drove past it. Children played nearby. There was a gas station on the corner. And inside, in the basement and the upper floors, people were being tortured, systematically, with the kind of routine that comes from doing something every day. The method preferred was the picana electrica, an electric cattle prod applied to the most sensitive parts of the body. Sessions could last hours. They were not primarily about extracting information, though names were demanded. They were about breaking a person completely, about making them understand, in every nerve ending they possessed, that the state owned their body. Here is a thing I have sat with while writing this episode. Torture chambers require staff. They require people who come to work in the morning, do their shift, go home at night. There were doctors present at some ESMA sessions, monitoring vital signs so that prisoners did not die too quickly to be of use. Medical school graduates, people who had taken an oath. The disappeared, the Desaparecidos, numbered somewhere between 9,000 and 30,000, depending on the source. The Argentine government's own Truth Commission, in 1984, documented nearly 9,000 cases with names and evidence, while explicitly acknowledging the real number was certainly higher. Human rights organizations put it closer to 30,000. The uncertainty is itself a product of the system. Bodies were dumped at sea from military aircraft, loaded onto what the officers called the vuelos de la muerte, the death flights. Prisoners were drugged, loaded onto planes, and dropped alive into the Rio de la Plata or the Atlantic. No body, no crime. The logic was explicit. It was discussed in operational planning meetings. Adolfo Scilingo, a former Navy officer, confessed to participating in these flights in 1995. He described what it was like to push a living person out of a plane. He said they were told it was a Christian death, more humane than a firing squad. He said, after the first flight, he went to a priest for absolution. The priest told him it was a war, and in war these things were necessary. He said he went on 2 more flights after that. Let that sit for a second. The regime understood something that other atrocities of the 20th century had also proven. Disappearance is more effective than execution. A body is evidence. A body can become a martyr. A body forces you to confront what happened. But a person who simply ceases to exist, who is taken and never comes back, whose fate is never officially acknowledged, that person becomes a ghost, and ghosts cannot testify. The families told nothing. That was deliberate policy. A mother would go to a police station to ask about her son and be told he was never detained. She would go to a hospital, a court, a government ministry, told nothing, shown nothing, sent away. Some families were told their children had simply left the country, had run off, were abroad somewhere, had abandoned their families without a word. The cruelty of this, the specific targeted cruelty of leaving parents to wonder, was not incidental. It was structural. 14 mothers began meeting in the Plaza de Mayo in April 1977, circling the square in silence because gatherings were illegal. They wore white headscarves. They carried photographs of their children. The regime called them Las Locas, the madwomen, and assumed grief made them easy to dismiss. They were the most dangerous people in Argentina. Adriana Calvo was eventually released, after months of detention, one of the minority who came back. She co-founded an organization for former political prisoners. She gave testimony to the Truth Commission. She testified at trials. She stood in rooms and described what had been done to her and what she had witnessed being done to others, in the flat, unflinching tone of someone who has decided that precision is the only adequate response to what happened. She described a fellow prisoner, a young woman, who had given birth at the detention center and whose baby was taken from her. The baby was given to another family, a family connected to the military. The mother was later killed. The child grew up not knowing who she was. This was not an isolated case. The theft of children was a policy, not an aberration, not individual officers acting on impulse. A policy, discussed at command level, implemented systematically. Pregnant women were kept alive specifically so they could deliver. After delivery, the child was taken. The mother was then, in most cases, killed. Estimates suggest somewhere between 500 and 600 children were stolen this way and given to families, often military families, often childless couples, who raised them under false names, with false histories, with no knowledge of where they actually came from. The junta called this saving the children, saving them from subversive parents. The logic was not hidden, it was explicit in internal documents. The children were considered contaminated by bloodline, redeemable only if removed and re-raised correctly. This is the kind of sentence that sounds like something from a different century, a different species of human cruelty. It happened in a country with a modern economy, European immigrant culture, universities, opera houses, and a capital city that called itself the Paris of South America. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the abuelas, formed separately from the mothers for the specific purpose of finding these children. They partnered with geneticists to develop a method of matching grandchildren to biological families through mitochondrial DNA. The technology was partly invented for them because the problem they were trying to solve had never existed at this scale before. They have so far identified over 130 of the stolen children. Most of those individuals are now in their 40s. Some have embraced their biological families. Some have refused. Some found out they were taken, and that the people who raised them knew exactly what they were doing. A man named Juan Cabandier discovered in 2003, when he was in his mid-20s, that his real name was not his name, that his biological parents had been disappeared, that the police officer who raised him had been his parents' torturer. He is now a member of the Argentine government. The dictatorship fell not because it was defeated militarily, but because it collapsed economically and then, finally, overreached in the one direction it could not recover from. In April 1982, facing a population that was starting to protest in numbers too large to disappear, Admiral Leopoldo Galtieri ordered the invasion of the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas, a piece of nationalist theater designed to flood the streets with flags instead of grievances. It worked, briefly. For a few weeks, the crowds in the Plaza de Mayo were chanting for the regime, not against it. Then Britain sent a task force. The Argentine military, which had spent 7 years perfecting the art of torturing students, discovered it was not prepared to fight a conventional war against a professional navy. The Malvinas were lost in 10 weeks. Galtieri resigned. The junta dissolved into itself. Elections were called. In December 1983, Raúl Alfonsín became the first democratically elected president since the coup. He did something that, at the time, no one in Latin America had done. He prosecuted the generals. The 1985 trial of the junta commanders, the Juicio a las Juntas, was not a victor's tribunal or a performance of power. It was a domestic criminal court in the defendant's own country, examining the defendant's own crimes against their own citizens in proceedings governed by their own laws. Videla received life imprisonment. Massera received life imprisonment. Others received decades. A prosecutor named Julio Cesar Stracera delivered a closing argument that ended with 8 words borrowed from Nuremberg: Nunca más, never again. The courtroom erupted. It lasted, for a while. A military rebellion in 1987 forced Alfonsín's government to pass amnesty laws, the Ley de Punto Final and the Ley de Obediencia Debida, which effectively blocked prosecution of anyone below the top command level. The argument was pragmatic. The fragile democracy could not survive another coup attempt. The generals had made clear they would attempt one if prosecutions continued. So the prosecution stopped. An entire apparatus of perpetrators, the men who had actually run the camps, who had actually applied the picana, who had actually stood in the doorways of aircraft at night, walked free and went home to their families. The families of the disappeared watched this happen from the Plaza de Mayo. Carlos Menem, who succeeded Alfonsín, pardoned Videla and Massera in 1990. They were released from prison. Videla, in interviews given after his release, expressed no regret. He said the process had been necessary. He said it had been a war. He said God and history would judge him kindly. He lived freely for 12 more years. In 2003, under President Nestor Kirchner, the amnesty laws were annulled and the prosecutions restarted. Videla was rearrested. Massera, by then suffering from dementia, died before a new sentence could be finalized. Videla was convicted again in 2010, sentenced again to life, and died in prison in 2013 at the age of 87, in an ordinary cell, having outlived most of his victims by decades. This is not justice. It resembles justice. There is a difference. Here is what Argentina's dirty war reveals, if you look at it steadily. It reveals that the architecture of atrocity does not require monsters. It requires bureaucrats and doctors and pilots and priests who are willing to bless what they know to be wrong. The ESMA employed hundreds of people across its years of operation. Someone ordered the electricity. Someone maintained the records. Someone typed the transfers, processed the intake forms, noted the cell numbers. The scale of this requires not a handful of sadists, but a functioning institution staffed by ordinary professionals who had decided, one way or another, that this was work they could do. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It is not supposed to be. It reveals that disappearance as a tool of power is not just about killing. It is about the transmission of fear. The families who received no answers, who were sent from office to office with nothing, who could not grieve because they did not have proof of death. They were instruments of the policy. Their uncertainty was the policy. Every Argentine who watched a neighbor be taken and said nothing, who changed the subject, who looked away, that person had absorbed the message that the state intended to send. This is what control without accountability looks like at its most refined, and it reveals something about resistance. 14 women with photographs, walking in circles in a public square, were more dangerous to the generals than anything else in Argentina at that moment, because they refused the grammar of disappearance. They insisted on visibility, on names, on the stubborn public fact of grief. The regime called them madwomen. The regime was right to be afraid of them. Adriana Calvo died in 2014. She had given decades of testimony by then. She had described what happened at the detention center so many times, in so many rooms, before so many courts, that the events had passed through her and into the public record in the way that only repetition can achieve. She was not a symbol. She was a physics teacher who survived something no one should have survived, and who decided that surviving obligated her to speak. The 30,000, whether the number is 9,000 or 30,000, whether the archives are ever fully opened or not, were not abstractions. They were people who were taken from their lives in the middle of ordinary days, by agents of a government that had decided they were obstacles to order. They were hooded before they reached the car. They were given numbers instead of names. They were dropped into the sea. The generals wanted them erased. What the generals could not account for was the people who refused to allow that. The mothers in the square, the grandmothers with their DNA databases, the survivors who kept returning to courtrooms to say, again, what was done. The children who grew up and found out what their real names were. Memory is not passive. It is a form of resistance, the same way it was then, the same way it is whenever states decide that certain people did not deserve to exist. The act of remembering, precisely, with names, with dates, with the specific detail of a hood placed over a woman's head before she even reached the car, is a refusal to let the erasure stand. That is why this is remembered. That is why it has to be. Subscribe for new episodes every week. This Actually Happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten, to understand what they reveal about power, human nature, and civilization, because history demands to be remembered.